Montana Territory, 1875. The snow fell in thick, downy flakes, blanketing the rolling plains surrounding Timber Creek with a pristine white coat that glittered beneath the winter sun. Quincy Lawson pulled his worn leather gloves tighter and surveyed the landscape from atop his chestnut mare. At 26, he had already carved out a respectable piece of this untamed country, a small but thriving cattle ranch that stood as testament to 4 years of backbreaking work. The December wind cut sharp across his face, numbing his clean-shaven cheeks and bringing tears to his eyes that he quickly blinked away. Christmas, he muttered to himself, the word feeling hollow in his mouth. Another year alone. Quincy nudged his horse forward through the knee-high drifts toward the barn, where the livestock needed tending regardless of holidays or heartache. His broad shoulders, strong from years of ranch work, hunched slightly against the cold as he rode. Though young, his eyes carried the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much of the frontier's harsh justice. They were kind eyes, his mother had once told him, but they seldom softened these days. The distant smoke from his cabin chimney promised warmth, but not comfort, not really. A house needed more than walls and a hearth to be a home, he believed, though he'd never admit such sentimentality aloud. The West made quick work of dreamers and romantics. Quincy had learned that lesson when he'd buried his parents 5 years earlier, victims of a harsh winter and harsher sickness that swept through these parts without mercy. "You heading into town for the Christmas social?" Lawson called his nearest neighbor, old Frank Holloway, who was checking his fence line a quarter-mile out. "No need," Quincy called back, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Cattle don't take holidays." Frank shook his head, snow catching in his gray beard. "Young man like you shouldn't be alone on Christmas. Pretty girls coming from all over the county." Quincy just waved him off. The hard truth he'd accepted long ago was that love was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. People who opened their hearts out here only invited pain when the inevitable happened: disease, accident, Indian attacks, or simply the crushing weight of frontier life that broke spirits as easily as it broke bodies. Better to keep to himself, tend his herd, and survive. That was enough. He'd convinced himself of this so thoroughly that he almost believed it. The barn offered shelter from the cutting wind, and Quincy took his time brushing down his mare and feeding the livestock. The rhythmic work of ranch chores had always settled his mind. Here, alone with his animals, he could almost forget the approaching holiday and the memories it dredged up of family gatherings long past. His ranch was building into something substantial: 40 head of cattle, 2 good horses, and land as far as he could see from his front porch. That was something real, something that couldn't be taken by disease or desertion. "That's all a man needs," he told his mare as he patted her neck, his voice echoing in the empty barn. "Something to build, something that depends on you." The horse nickered softly, as if disagreeing. "Don't you start," Quincy said with a rare chuckle. "Next you'll be joining Frank in pushing me toward town dances." But as he made his way back to his cabin through the deepening twilight, the weight of solitude pressed heavier with each footstep. The cabin windows glowed with lamplight. He'd left the lamps burning to welcome himself home, a small gesture that only underscored how empty the place would be when he entered. 4 rooms he'd built with his own hands, solid and weather-tight, with none of the refinements that might make it inviting to anyone but himself. Inside, he shrugged off his heavy coat and stoked the fire. The familiar routine of preparing a simple supper for one carried him through the next hour. Only when he sat at his rough-hewn table, staring at his plate of beans and salt pork, did the silence of the place press in around him like a physical thing. "Merry Christmas Eve to me," he muttered, then immediately felt foolish for talking to himself. It was a habit of the lonely, and Quincy Lawson was not lonely. He was self-sufficient. There was a difference. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by the howling of distant wolves and dreams of a life he insisted he didn't want. Morning brought no relief, only the stark reality of Christmas Day, another in a line of days that held no special meaning beyond the work they contained. He was halfway through his morning coffee when the sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled him to the window. Visitors were rare this far out, especially in winter. Squinting through the glass, frosted at the edges despite the heat from his stove, he made out the shape of the Timber Creek stagecoach laboring through the snow. "What in blazes?" he muttered, grabbing his coat and hat. The coach had no business being out this far. His ranch lay a good 5 miles from the main road to town. As it drew closer, he could see the driver struggling with the team, the horses clearly exhausted from plowing through deep drifts. Stepping onto his porch, Quincy watched as the coach pulled to a stop in front of his cabin. "Merry Christmas, Lawson," called the driver, a man named Jenkins who ran the Timber Creek to Helena route. "Got a delivery for you." Quincy frowned, approaching cautiously. "I'm not expecting anything, Jenkins." "Well, someone's expecting you," the driver replied with a grin, jumping down to open the coach door. "Found her half frozen at the station yesterday. Said she'd come all the way from Missouri looking for Quincy Lawson's ranch." Quincy's heart leaped into his throat as the coach door swung open. A small gloved hand emerged, followed by a young woman wrapped in a travel-worn cloak. She stepped carefully down, her eyes immediately finding his across the snowy yard. She couldn't have been more than 21 or 22, with golden blonde hair peeking from beneath her bonnet and cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Her dress, visible beneath her open cloak, was a modest blue calico, clearly chosen for practicality rather than fashion. But it was her eyes that captured him, large, expressive, and the deepest shade of blue he'd ever seen, like the Montana sky in summer. "Mr. Lawson?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly, whether from cold or nerves he couldn't tell. Quincy found himself nodding, unable to form words as the woman approached, her boots crunching in the snow. She stopped a few feet from him, studying his face with an intensity that made him want to step back. "My name is Tessa Taylor," she said, drawing a deep breath. "I was a friend of your sister, Elizabeth." The name hit Quincy like a physical blow. Elizabeth, his younger sister who had moved back east to live with their aunt after their parents died. The sister whose letters had grown increasingly infrequent over the past year until they'd stopped altogether 3 months ago. "Elizabeth," he repeated, his voice hoarse. "Isn't she?" "She passed away 2 months ago," Tessa said gently, her eyes filling with tears. "Consumption took her quickly. I was with her at the end." Quincy's world tilted. Another grave he would never visit, another piece of his heart gone forever. He'd been right all along, caring for people only guaranteed pain. "I'm sorry to bring such news on Christmas Day," Tessa continued, "but she made me promise to find you." She had something she wanted you to have." From inside her cloak, she withdrew a small leather-bound book and a sealed letter, her journal and her last words to you. Quincy took them mechanically, his fingers numb. Behind them, Jenkins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I should be getting back before the snow gets worse," the driver said. "Miss Taylor paid for passage to your ranch, but—" He hesitated, looking between them. Quincy suddenly realized the implication. This woman had come all this way to deliver his sister's final words, with no apparent plan for what came after. "You have nowhere to go," he stated rather than asked. Tessa straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin with quiet dignity. "I promised Elizabeth I would find you. Beyond that," she gestured vaguely at the empty landscape around them. "I have enough for a room in town for a few days, while I figure out my next steps." Jenkins coughed. "No rooms to be had in Timber Creek right now, miss. Christmas travelers have filled the boarding house, and the saloon ain't no place for a lady." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the snorting of the coach horses and the whistle of wind across the plains. Quincy felt the weight of his sister's journal in his hand, felt the eyes of this stranger upon him, this woman who had been with Elizabeth when he had not. "You'll stay here," he found himself saying, the words coming before he had fully formed the thought. "At least until the weather breaks and you can find proper accommodations." Relief flashed across Tessa's face, quickly masked by polite gratitude. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," Quincy cut in, more gruffly than he intended. "It's Christmas and you've come a long way. My sister would never forgive me if I turned away her friend." Her smile then, small and grateful, stirred something in him that he immediately tried to suppress. This was Christian charity, nothing more, a temporary arrangement until the woman could be safely delivered to wherever she was heading. The last thing he needed was another person to worry about, another heart to care for in this unforgiving country. As Jenkins helped unload Tessa's single trunk from the coach, Quincy stood awkwardly on his porch, suddenly seeing his cabin through a stranger's eyes, the sparse furnishings, the lack of decorations, the overwhelming maleness of the space. It wasn't much, but it was all he had to offer. "It's not fancy," he warned as he carried her trunk inside. Tessa followed, removing her bonnet to reveal the full glory of her golden hair, neatly pinned back but still catching the light from the windows like spun gold. "It's warm and dry, Mr. Lawson. After 3 weeks of travel, that's luxury enough." The coach departed, leaving them alone with the awkward silence of strangers forced into intimacy by circumstance. Quincy showed her to the small second bedroom, barely more than a storage space with a narrow bed he'd built years ago in the naive hope that someday his sister might visit. "I'll let you get settled," he said, retreating to the main room where he stood staring at the sealed letter in his hand, afraid to open it yet unable to set it down. Through the thin wall he could hear Tessa moving about, the soft sounds of a woman in his house, something he'd never expected to experience. The realization that Elizabeth was truly gone hadn't fully penetrated yet. She had been distant these past years, existing mainly in occasional letters, but knowing she was out there in the world had been a comfort. Now there was only this stranger, this Tessa Taylor, who had known his sister's final moments better than he ever would. Quincy sat heavily in his chair by the fire, finally breaking the seal on the letter with trembling fingers. Elizabeth's handwriting, once so familiar, now seemed like a ghost on the page. "My dearest brother, if you are reading this, then Tessa has found you, which gives me peace as I face what comes next. The doctors say I have little time left, and I find myself thinking of you alone on that ranch, building a life that contains everything except the most important thing, love. Quincy, I know how the loss of our parents hardened your heart. I've watched through your letters as you've withdrawn further into yourself, creating a fortress of solitude that even I couldn't breach. But a life without connection is merely survival, not living. I'm sending Tessa to you not only to bring you my final goodbye, but because she represents everything you've denied yourself: hope, faith, and the courage to embrace life despite its inevitable sorrows. She has lost as much as we have, yet she still believes in the goodness of the world. My Christmas wish for you, my stubborn brother, is that you will find the courage to tear down the walls you've built. Let someone in before it's too late. Life is too precious and too short to face alone. With all my love. Elizabeth." Quincy folded the letter carefully, his vision blurred. His sister's final wish seemed both impossibly simple and terrifyingly difficult: to open his heart again, to risk the pain that inevitably followed attachment in this harsh land. He tucked the letter into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, just as Tessa emerged from the bedroom. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly, her hands clasped before her. She had removed her travel cloak and smoothed her hair, though she still looked weary from her journey. "No," Quincy replied, quickly wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He gestured vaguely at the pocket containing the letter. "Thank you for bringing this to me." Tessa nodded, her eyes full of compassion. "Elizabeth spoke of you often. She worried about you out here alone." "I'm not alone," Quincy said automatically. "I have 40 head of cattle, 2 horses, and more work than I can handle most days." A small smile touched Tessa's lips. "That's almost exactly what she said you would say." The observation made him uncomfortable, as if his sister and this woman had discussed him at length, dissecting his solitary existence. He stood abruptly. "You must be hungry after your journey. I don't have much, but I can make coffee and there's salt pork and beans." "Please let me," Tessa said, moving toward the kitchen area with unexpected confidence. It would be nice to be useful after sitting in that coach for so long. Before he could protest, she had rolled up her sleeves and was examining his meager pantry with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to making do with little. "Do you have flour and lard? I could make biscuits to go with the beans." "In the bin by the stove," Quincy replied, somewhat bemused at how quickly she had taken charge of his kitchen. He watched as she moved efficiently around the small space, measuring and mixing with the ease of long practice. There was something both disconcerting and oddly comforting about having a woman in his house, bringing life and purpose to corners that had gathered dust and disuse. "How did you know my sister?" he asked finally, needing to fill the silence with something other than his conflicted thoughts. Tessa's hands continued working the dough as she spoke. "We met at the boarding house in St. Louis. I had come from Ohio looking for work as a seamstress, and Elizabeth had a room across the hall. She was already ill then, though she tried to hide it. Her voice softened with memory. She was so kind to me when I arrived with nothing but a trunk of clothes and too much hope." "Too much hope," Quincy echoed, finding the phrase curious. Tessa glanced up, her blue eyes meeting his. "That's what Elizabeth called it. She said I had too much hope for someone who's lost so much. But hope is free, Mr. Lawson. Sometimes it's all we have to keep us moving forward." The simple wisdom in her words struck him more deeply than he wanted to admit. Hope had been the first casualty of his parents' deaths, followed closely by faith in anything beyond what he could build with his own two hands. Yet this woman, clearly no stranger to hardship herself, spoke of hope as if it were as essential as bread or water. "And what brought you from Ohio to St. Louis?" he asked, changing the subject slightly. A shadow passed over Tessa's features. "The war took my father and brother. My mother passed soon after from grief, I think. Our farm went to creditors." She said this matter-of-factly, without self-pity, as she shaped the biscuit dough with practiced hands. "I had a talent for sewing and needed somewhere to start fresh." Quincy nodded, understanding all too well the need to begin again after loss. Yet while he had retreated into isolation, this young woman had journeyed toward new possibilities, carrying her hope like a lantern through darkness. "And now, after you leave here, where will you go?" he asked, realizing he was genuinely curious about her plans. Tessa placed the biscuits in the cast iron skillet and set them near the fire to bake before answering. "I'm not certain yet. I have some savings, enough to get to Helena or maybe even California. I hear there's good work for seamstresses in growing towns." She smiled slightly. "I suppose I'm still carrying too much hope." The meal they shared was simple, but more satisfying than anything Quincy had eaten in months. Tessa's biscuits were light and fluffy, a stark contrast to the heavy, often burnt offerings he made for himself. They ate mostly in silence, the intimacy of sharing a table with a stranger still too new for comfortable conversation. As twilight deepened outside the windows, Quincy realized with a start that it was still Christmas Day. In the shock of meeting Tessa and learning of Elizabeth's death, he had completely forgotten the holiday. "I'm sorry I have nothing to mark the day," he said awkwardly as they cleared the dishes. "No decorations or gifts." Tessa shook her head, a gentle smile softening her features. "You've given me shelter on Christmas Day, Mr. Lawson. That's gift enough." Later, as they sat before the fire, the howling wind outside making the cabin creak and groan, Quincy found himself studying Tessa's profile in the firelight. She was beautiful in an understated way, her features harmonious and expressive, but it was the quiet dignity with which she carried herself that impressed him most, a woman alone in the world, yet neither defeated nor bitter. "Will you tell me about her?" Tessa asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "About Elizabeth when she was younger. She spoke of your childhood, but I'd like to hear your memories." Something in Quincy wanted to refuse, to keep those precious memories locked away where they couldn't hurt him. But Elizabeth's letter burned against his chest, her final wish that he tear down his walls. Perhaps this small sharing was a place to start. "She was fearless," he began hesitantly, "even as a little girl. Once when she was 6 and I was 10, a mountain lion came near our first homestead. Pa was away hunting, and Ma was sick with fever. The cat was after our chickens, and Elizabeth marched right out onto the porch and rang Pa's dinner bell so hard it scared that cat halfway to the next county." The story opened a floodgate. And soon Quincy found himself sharing tale after tale of their childhood. Elizabeth's first horse, her skill with needle and thread that had blossomed into a talent for storytelling through quilts. Her stubborn insistence on justice, even when it got her in trouble. The memories, rather than bringing pain as he'd feared, felt like a balm. In the telling, Elizabeth seemed present again, alive in the space between him and Tessa. In turn, Tessa shared stories of her final months with Elizabeth, how she had continued to sew beautiful things even as her strength waned, how she had read aloud from books of poetry and adventure to the children at the boarding house, how her letters to Quincy had been treasured and read repeatedly. "She was proud of you," Tessa said softly, "of what you've built here." Night had fallen completely when Quincy finally showed Tessa to the small bedroom again. The day had been overwhelming, grief and connection intertwined in ways he couldn't have anticipated when he awoke alone that morning. "Thank you," he said awkwardly at her door, "for bringing her words to me, for remembering her." Tessa's eyes, luminous in the lamplight, held his. "Memory keeps those we love alive, Mr. Lawson." Elizabeth understood that. "It's why she wanted so badly for me to find you, so her memory would live on in both of us." After she closed her door, Quincy stood for a long moment in the narrow hallway, Elizabeth's letter a physical weight against his heart. His sister's final wish seemed less impossible now than it had that morning. Something had shifted, a tiny crack appearing in the fortress he'd built around himself. But as he lay in his bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person breathing under his roof, Quincy reminded himself firmly that Tessa Taylor was a temporary visitor, a messenger who would soon continue on her journey. Opening his home for a few days was one thing, opening his heart was quite another. The West had taught him that lesson well, and he wasn't ready to unlearn it, no matter what his sister's Christmas wish might have been. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Quincy rose before dawn as usual, moving quietly through the cabin to avoid waking his guest. He built up the fire, put coffee on to boil, and stepped outside to tend to the livestock, the familiar routine grounding him after the emotional turbulence of the previous day. The cold air burned his lungs as he trudged through knee-deep snow to the barn. Inside, the animals greeted him with familiar sounds, the nickering of horses, the lowing of the milk cow he kept for butter and cheese. These were the companions of his solitary existence, the living things that depended on him, without demanding the emotional connection that humans required. He was halfway through the morning chores when the barn door creaked open, sending a shaft of brilliant winter sunlight across the hay-strewn floor. Tessa stood framed in the doorway, wrapped in what appeared to be every layer of clothing she owned, her breath visible in the cold air. "Good morning," she called cheerfully. "I thought you might like some help." Quincy straightened from where he'd been filling a water trough. "This isn't women's work," he said automatically, then immediately regretted his words when her expression fell slightly. "On my family's farm, everyone worked," she replied with quiet dignity. "My mother always said idle hands made for troubled minds." Quincy nodded, properly chastised. "I didn't mean," he began, but she waved off his apology. "Show me what needs doing," she said, stepping fully into the barn and pulling off her gloves. "I'm stronger than I look." Despite his initial reluctance, Quincy found himself accepting her help. Tessa moved with the confidence of someone who had indeed grown up understanding farm work. She handled the animals gently but capably, showing no fear of the larger cattle or horses. When she rolled up her sleeves to help him muck out stalls, he noticed calluses on her otherwise delicate hands, testament to a life of practical labor at odds with her refined speech and manner. "You mentioned you're a seamstress," he said as they worked side by side, "but you handle farm chores like you were born to them." Tessa smiled, a loose strand of golden hair falling across her flushed cheek. "I was born to them. My father raised horses in addition to crops. I could ride before I could walk properly, according to my mother." A shadow of memory passed over her face. "After they died, sewing was the only marketable skill I had that would allow me to support myself in a city." "You prefer farm life then?" Quincy asked, surprised to find himself genuinely interested in her answer. "I prefer honest work in open skies," she replied, looking past him to the barn door where the vast Montana landscape sparkled in the morning sun. "Cities have their advantages, but I never felt I could breathe properly there." As they finished the chores and walked back to the cabin together, Quincy found himself seeing his land through new eyes, not as the isolated outpost he'd built to keep the world at bay, but as the breathtaking country it was, stretching toward distant mountains beneath an endless blue sky. Inside the cabin, Tessa insisted on making breakfast, and Quincy found himself once again watching her move about his kitchen with growing familiarity. She hummed softly as she worked, an old hymn that his mother used to sing, the gentle melody filling spaces in the cabin that had known only silence for too long. "I hope you don't mind," she said, catching his gaze. "Music makes work lighter." "I don't mind," he replied, surprised to find it true. After breakfast, Quincy faced the awkward reality of having a woman in his home with no clear plan for what came next. The weather had cleared, but the snow was still deep, and the next stagecoach wouldn't pass through Timber Creek for 3 days. He was effectively stranded with a stranger who was quickly becoming something more complicated. "I should check the fence line on the north pasture," he said, more to himself than to her. "There were wolves howling last night." "May I come along?" Tessa asked immediately, her eyes bright with interest. "I've been cooped up in stagecoaches for weeks." Quincy hesitated. The north pasture was a good hour's ride, and the temperature, while clear, was bitter cold. "It's rough country, and you don't have proper winter gear." "I have my coat and gloves. And I'm not made of sugar, Mr. Lawson. I won't melt in the cold." The teasing lilt in her voice surprised him almost as much as the small dimple that appeared at the corner of her mouth when she smiled. Against his better judgment, Quincy found himself saddling 2 horses an hour later. He helped Tessa mount his more docile mare, trying to ignore the feeling of her small waist beneath his hands as he lifted her into the saddle. She arranged her skirts with practiced ease, sitting astride rather than side saddle without a hint of self-consciousness. My father scandalized half the county letting me ride astride, she explained, noting his raised eyebrow. But he said it was foolishness to put a woman at risk of falling, just to satisfy propriety. Your father sounds like a practical man, Quincy observed as they set off through the snow. He was, Tessa agreed, her voice soft with memory. He believed in living by principles rather than conventions. It's why he joined the Union Army, even though he was past the age when most men would fight. She straightened in the saddle, visibly pushing the melancholy away. He would have loved this country, all this space and possibility. They rode in comfortable silence through the crystalline landscape. The recent snow blanketed everything in pristine white, transforming familiar terrain into something magical. Occasionally, Tessa would point to animal tracks or ask about landmarks on the horizon, her curiosity about his land both flattering and disarming. At the north fence line, they dismounted to check for damage. Quincy was impressed that Tessa immediately began examining the fence posts and wires alongside him, her small hands testing connections with surprising strength. "You know something about fencing," he observed as she correctly identified a weakened post. "My brother taught me," she replied, stomping snow away from the base of the post to better examine it. He said a woman should understand the workings of a farm as well as any man, especially in times of war when men might be called away. The simple practicality of her upbringing resonated with Quincy. Here was a woman raised not as a delicate ornament, but as a capable partner in the business of living, a stark contrast to the few, eligible women in Timber Creek, most of whom seemed to view ranch life as a hardship to be endured rather than a calling to be embraced. They worked together to reinforce the weak section, Quincy holding the post steady while Tessa helped secure the wire. The physical labor in the cold air brought color to her cheeks and a brightness to her eyes that transformed her from merely pretty to truly beautiful. "There," she said with satisfaction as they finished, "that should hold against your wolves." "Our wolves are particularly determined," Quincy replied without thinking, then froze as he realized the implication of his words. "Our wolves." As if she belonged here, as if this land were partly hers. If Tessa noticed his slip, she gave no indication, already moving back toward the horses, but as she reached for the reins, her foot caught in a hidden depression beneath the snow. She stumbled, crying out in surprise, and would have fallen if Quincy hadn't lunged forward to catch her. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, her body pressed against his arms wrapped securely around her waist, their faces close enough that he could feel her warm breath against his chin. Her eyes widened, the deep blue darkening as her pupils expanded, and Quincy felt something shift between them, an awareness that had nothing to do with the cold or the fence or the practicalities that had defined their interactions until now. "Thank you," she whispered, making no immediate move to pull away. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. The moment stretched, taut with possibility, until the distant howl of a wolf broke the spell. Tessa stepped back, adjusting her coat with slightly trembling hands, while Quincy busied himself checking the saddle girth with unnecessary thoroughness. The ride back to the cabin was quieter, charged with an undercurrent of awareness that made even casual conversation seem weighted with deeper meaning. By unspoken agreement, they focused on safe topics: the quality of the grazing land, the prospects for spring calving, the merits of different horse breeds for ranch work. But when they crested the final rise and the cabin came into view, Quincy found himself seeing it differently. The lonely outpost he'd built as a fortress against the world now looked small and incomplete against the vast landscape, a beginning rather than an ending, the foundation for something that might yet grow. The thought disturbed him more than he cared to admit. That evening, after another shared meal that felt alarmingly domestic, they sat before the fire with cups of coffee. Outside, the temperature had plummeted with the setting sun, and the wind had picked up again, moaning around the eaves of the cabin like a restless spirit. "Will you tell me about your sister's journal?" Tessa asked suddenly, nodding toward the leather-bound book that Quincy had placed on the mantel, unable to bring himself to read it yet. She wrote in it every day, even when she was very ill. Quincy stared at the journal, remembering how Elizabeth had always been the one to document their family history, preserving memories that would otherwise have been lost to time. "I haven't had the courage to open it," he admitted. Tessa's expression softened with understanding. "Would it help if I read some of it aloud?" She wanted you to have her words. After a moment's hesitation, Quincy nodded, reaching for the journal and handing it to her. Tessa took it gently, running her fingers over the worn leather before opening to the first page. Her voice, clear and expressive, filled the cabin as she began to read, September 12, 1874. St. Louis is not the bustling metropolis I imagined, but rather a city of contrasts, elegant mansions alongside desperate poverty, the Mississippi both life-giving artery and dangerous barrier. I think often of Quincy alone on his Montana ranch, building something from nothing while I seek a different kind of independence here. We are more alike than he would admit, both stubborn in our determination to forge our own paths. As Tessa continued reading, Elizabeth's voice seemed to fill the room, observant, thoughtful, often gently humorous in her descriptions of city life. She wrote of her growing friendship with the remarkable Miss T, whose quiet strength reminded Elizabeth of their mother. She documented her declining health with clear-eyed pragmatism, interspersed with vivid memories of their childhood and reflections on the meaning of home. March 3, 1875. The doctor spoke frankly today. My lungs are failing faster than expected, and I find myself dwelling not on what I'm losing, but on what Quincy has already lost, the ability to believe that love is worth the risk of pain. How strange that, as my body weakens, my conviction grows stronger. We are not meant to walk this earth alone, no matter how fiercely independent we believe ourselves to be. Quincy swallowed hard, Elizabeth's insight cutting too close to the truths he'd hidden even from himself. He studied Tessa's face as she read, noting how her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, how she paused occasionally to compose herself before continuing. His sister's words were clearly as meaningful to her as they were to him, creating a bridge between them that neither had anticipated. When Tessa finally closed the journal, the cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the persistent wind outside. They sat without speaking for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts, until Quincy finally found his voice. "Thank you," he said simply, "for being with her, for bringing her words home." Tessa nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "She was worried you wouldn't understand why she sent me, that you might think she was interfering." "Was she?" Quincy asked, a note of challenge in his voice despite himself. "Interfering?" Tessa met his gaze steadily. Elizabeth believed that sometimes the greatest gift we can give those we love is the truth they're afraid to see for themselves. "And what truth did she think I couldn't see?" "That you've built walls instead of bridges," Tessa replied softly. "That you're using this land as an excuse to stop living." The words stung all the more because they echoed his sister's letter too closely to dismiss. "You don't know me," he said, more harshly than he intended. "No," Tessa agreed, unflinching in the face of his anger. "But Elizabeth did, and she loved you enough to send me across half a continent because she believed you deserved more than survival." Quincy stood abruptly, needing to put physical distance between himself and the uncomfortable truths Tessa represented. "It's getting late, we should both get some rest." Tessa rose as well, returning Elizabeth's journal to the mantel with careful hands. "Of course, thank you for sharing this day with me, Mr. Lawson." "Quincy," he corrected automatically. "If you're going to tell me hard truths, you might as well use my given name." A small smile touched her lips. "Quincy then, and I'm Tessa, not Miss Taylor." "Tessa," he repeated, the name feeling surprisingly right on his tongue. "Good night." Later, lying awake in his bed listening to the wind rattling the windows, Quincy found his thoughts circling back to Elizabeth's words and Tessa's quiet challenge. Had he really been merely surviving rather than living? Had his determination to need no one become a prison rather than protection? The questions followed him into uneasy dreams, where Elizabeth and Tessa became interchangeable, both beckoning him toward something he couldn't quite see but instinctively feared. Morning brought no clarity, only the awareness that Tessa Taylor had been under his roof for barely 48 hours and had already disrupted the careful isolation he'd constructed over years. What troubled him most was not her presence but how quickly he was adapting to it, setting an extra place at the table, considering her comfort when banking the fire for the night, listening for her movements in the small bedroom across the hall. The stagecoach would return to Timber Creek in 2 days. Logic dictated that Tessa would be on it, continuing to whatever future awaited her in Helena or beyond. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it settled in his chest like a stone. Over breakfast, Tessa mentioned casually that she had noticed his shirts needed mending. "I could take care of that today, if you'd like." "It's the least I can do while I'm here." Quincy started to refuse, not wanting to be further indebted to her, but practicality won out. His sewing skills were rudimentary at best, and several of his work shirts were hanging together by stubbornness alone. If you're sure you don't mind, he said finally. Not at all, I enjoy having useful work. While Quincy tended to outdoor chores, Tessa transformed his kitchen table into a seamstress's workstation, laying out his worn shirts alongside her small sewing kit. When he came in for the midday meal, he found her humming contentedly as she worked, her nimble fingers repairing a torn sleeve with stitches so tiny they were nearly invisible. You're very skilled, he observed, genuinely impressed. Tessa looked up with a smile that transformed her face, lighting her eyes and bringing a natural grace to her features that made his breath catch unexpectedly. Thank you. There's something satisfying about mending, don't you think? Taking what's broken and making it whole again. The metaphor wasn't lost on him, but Quincy chose not to acknowledge it directly. I'm afraid you'll find plenty to satisfy you here then. I'm hard on clothes. As any hardworking man should be, she replied, setting aside the finished shirt and rising to help him prepare lunch. They fell into an easy rhythm, working together in the small kitchen as if they'd been doing it for years rather than days. Tessa seemed to anticipate his movements, handing him items before he asked for them, stepping aside just before he needed to reach past her. There was a natural choreography to their interactions that Quincy found both alarming and strangely comforting. Tell me about your ranch, she said as they ate. Elizabeth mentioned you had plans to expand. The question launched him into a detailed explanation of his ambitions for the property, increasing his herd, adding more grazing land to the west, eventually building a larger house to replace the cabin. Tessa listened with genuine interest, asking insightful questions that revealed her understanding of agricultural economics and land management. You've thought about all the practical aspects, she observed when he finished. What about the rest? The rest. The life you'll build here, beyond the cattle and land. Her blue eyes were serious as she studied his face. Will you eventually bring a wife to that larger house, raise children to inherit what you're building? Quincy shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct questions about his personal aspirations. I haven't given it much thought, he admitted. The work itself has been enough. Has it? Tessa asked softly, not pressing but not retreating either. The question lingered between them, unanswered but not forgotten as they cleared the dishes and Tessa returned to her mending. Quincy escaped to the barn, telling himself he had repairs that couldn't wait, but in truth, he needed space to think away from her perceptive gaze and unsettling questions. The afternoon passed in productive labor, Quincy losing himself in the familiar rhythms of ranch work while his mind circled around the conversation with Tessa. Had the work truly been enough? Or had he simply convinced himself it must be because the alternatives, risking his heart, opening himself to possible loss, seemed too dangerous to contemplate? When he returned to the cabin as dusk approached, he found Tessa standing on the porch, her face lifted to catch the last rays of the setting sun. She had wrapped one of his old blankets around her shoulders against the cold, and the sight of her there, a solitary figure silhouetted against the vast Montana landscape, struck him with unexpected force. She belonged in this tableau somehow, her quiet strength matching the rugged beauty of the land itself. It's breathtaking, she said as he approached, gesturing toward the horizon where the sun painted the snow-covered plains in shades of gold and rose. I've never seen anything so vast and beautiful. It can be harsh too, Quincy felt compelled to point out, stopping beside her on the porch. Blizzards that last for days, summer droughts that crack the earth, hailstorms that can destroy a season's work in minutes. Tessa nodded thoughtfully. Like life itself, then. Beautiful and harsh in equal measure, she turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. The question is whether the beauty is worth the harshness. I've always thought it was. Again, her words seemed to carry multiple meanings, challenging him to look beyond the literal. Before Quincy could formulate a response, she continued, I finished mending your shirts. I noticed your quilt has some tears as well. I could repair those tomorrow if you'd like. The domestic offer, so ordinary after their philosophical exchange, caught him off guard. You don't need to keep earning your keep, Tessa. You're a guest here. I know, but I like being useful, she smiled slightly, and I suspect you're not used to accepting help, so consider it practice. The gentle teasing in her voice made something warm unfurl in his chest. Are all Ohio women this stubborn, or is it just you? Oh, it's a particular talent of the Taylor women, she replied with mock seriousness. My mother could outstubborn a mule when she set her mind to something. I believe it, Quincy said, finding himself smiling in return. You must take after her. Tessa's expression softened. That's perhaps the nicest thing anyone has said to me in a long time. I would like to think I inherited her better qualities. They stood in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared overhead. The temperature was dropping rapidly, but Quincy found himself reluctant to suggest they go inside, to break the fragile connection that seemed to have formed between them in this quiet moment. Finally, Tessa shivered visibly beneath the blanket, and practicality won out over sentiment. We should go in before you freeze, he said, opening the door for her. The cabin welcomed them with warmth, and the lingering smells of the stew Tessa had prepared earlier. As they moved around the small space preparing for evening, Quincy was struck again by how quickly he'd adapted to having her there, how the cabin felt fuller, more complete with her presence. The stagecoach would return tomorrow. The thought hit him with unexpected force as he stoked the fire for the night. Tomorrow, Tessa would have the opportunity to continue her journey, to leave him and this ranch behind as she sought her fortune elsewhere. The prospect, which should have brought relief, instead filled him with a hollow feeling he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Tessa, he began, then hesitated, unsure what he wanted to say. She looked up from where she was arranging her sewing supplies, her expression expectant. I thank you for the mending, and for reading Elizabeth's journal. It meant a great deal. Her smile was gentle, as if she understood all the things he wasn't saying. You're welcome, Quincy. Thank you for sharing your home with me. That night, lying awake in the darkness, Quincy found himself contemplating possibilities he'd long ago dismissed. What would it be like to have a permanent companion in this life he'd built? Someone to share not just the work but the beauty and harshness of it all. The thought was both terrifying and strangely compelling. Elizabeth's words echoed in his mind. A life without connection is merely survival, not living. Had his sister sent Tessa to him knowing exactly what kind of disruption she would cause in his carefully ordered existence? Morning brought a clear sky and the distant rumble of the approaching stagecoach. Quincy had risen early, unable to sleep, and was standing on the porch when he first heard it, the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the creak of wheels across the frozen ground. The sound filled him with a dread he couldn't rationalize. Tessa emerged from the cabin, drawn by the noise. She had dressed carefully in her blue calico dress, her blonde hair neatly pinned beneath her bonnet. The small trunk that contained all her worldly possessions sat packed and ready just inside the door. That would be the stage, she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. Quincy nodded, unable to find words as they watched the coach approach. It was still distant, maybe 15 minutes away, laboring through the snow-filled ruts of the seldom-used path to his ranch. Quincy, Tessa began, her voice hesitant for perhaps the first time since he'd met her. I want to thank you for your hospitality these past days. I know my arrival was unexpected, and my presence perhaps unwelcome at first. Not unwelcome, he corrected quickly, turning to face her. Unexpected, yes, but never unwelcome. A small smile touched her lips. Nevertheless, I appreciate your kindness, and I want you to know that everything Elizabeth said about you was true. You're a good man building something worthwhile here. The praise warmed him even as it increased the strange sense of loss he felt watching the approaching stage. Where will you go? He asked, the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. Tessa looked out across the snow-covered landscape, considering. Helena first, I suppose. I have a letter of introduction to a dressmaker there who might have work. She hesitated, then added more softly, though I find myself strangely reluctant to leave this place. The admission sent a jolt of something like hope through Quincy's chest. Before he could examine the feeling or respond, however, the stagecoach had pulled up in front of the cabin, Jenkins, the driver, calling out a cheerful greeting. Morning, Lawson, Miss Taylor. Beautiful day for traveling, though the pass is still tricky with snow. Tessa stepped forward, smiling politely at the driver. Good morning, Mr. Jenkins. How was your journey from town? Slow but steady, Jenkins replied, jumping down to stretch his legs. We're running a bit behind schedule on account of a fallen tree across the road. Had to clear it before we could pass. He glanced between them with barely concealed curiosity. Will you be joining us for the return trip to Timber Creek, Miss Taylor? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Quincy found himself holding his breath, though he had no right to influence her decision. Tessa hesitated, her gaze flickering briefly to Quincy before returning to the driver. She began, but was interrupted by the cabin door banging open behind them. Quincy turned to see what had caused the noise, and was startled to find his trunk had somehow tipped over, spilling its contents across the porch. A gust of wind must have caught the door and knocked into the trunk, though he couldn't recall the breeze being that strong. "Oh dear," Tessa exclaimed, hurrying to gather her scattered belongings. "I'm so sorry for the delay, Mr. Jenkins." Quincy moved to help her, kneeling beside the trunk as Tessa quickly repacked her modest collection of clothes and personal items. Among them, he noticed a small, worn daguerreotype in a simple frame, a family portrait showing a younger Tessa with a kindly-looking couple and a young man who must have been her brother. "Your family?" he asked softly, handing her the picture. Tessa nodded, her fingers tracing the faces with gentle reverence before carefully wrapping the frame in a shawl and placing it in the trunk. "All I have left of them now." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity but with quiet dignity, struck Quincy deeply. This woman, who had lost everything and everyone she loved, still approached life with hope and openness. She had crossed half a continent carrying nothing but that small trunk and the belief that something better awaited her. Her courage made his own careful isolation seem suddenly cowardly by comparison. "Jenkins," he called, making a decision he hadn't known he was considering until that moment. "Could you wait a few minutes? I need to speak with Miss Taylor privately." The driver nodded, tipping his hat. "Take your time, Lawson. Like I said, we're already running behind, so a few more minutes won't matter." Quincy helped Tessa to her feet, then guided her a short distance away from the cabin, out of earshot of the curious driver. His heart was pounding with a nervousness he hadn't felt since he'd first staked his claim on this land 4 years earlier. "Tessa," he began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "I know we've only known each other a few days, and this may seem forward or even foolish, but," he drew a deep breath, "would you consider staying, not just for a while but permanently?" Her blue eyes widened in surprise. "Quincy, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that in 3 days you've brought more life to this place than I have in 4 years. I'm saying that Elizabeth was right. I've been surviving, not living. And I'm saying that the thought of you leaving on that stage makes me realize how empty this ranch will be without you." Tessa's expression softened, but uncertainty remained in her eyes. "Are you offering me a position?" "As a housekeeper, perhaps." "No," Quincy said firmly, finally understanding what he truly wanted. "I'm asking if you might consider building a life here, with me, as partners in every sense." A blush rose to Tessa's cheeks, but she held his gaze steadily. "We barely know each other, Quincy." "I know," he acknowledged, "and I'm not proposing marriage this instant. That would indeed be foolish. But I'm asking if you would stay, allow us to know each other better, and consider the possibility of a future together." Tessa glanced back at the waiting stagecoach, then out across the snow-covered ranch that stretched toward distant mountains. "It's a beautiful place," she said softly. "Beautiful and harsh," Quincy reminded her, echoing her words from the previous evening. "But maybe that's exactly why it shouldn't be faced alone." A smile slowly bloomed on Tessa's face, transforming her from pretty to breathtaking. "My mother always said that God works in mysterious ways," she said. "I think she would find it particularly mysterious that I traveled all this way to deliver a message, only to find—" She paused, suddenly shy. "To find what?" Quincy pressed gently. "A place where I might belong," she finished softly. The hope that had been building in Quincy's chest expanded into something warmer, brighter. "Is that a yes, you'll stay?" Tessa nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes. I'll stay and see where this path leads us." Relief and joy surged through him with such force that Quincy acted without thinking, drawing her into an embrace that was part gratitude, part celebration. Tessa stiffened momentarily in surprise, then relaxed against him, her arms slipping around his waist as she returned the embrace. "Jenkins will be scandalized," she murmured against his shoulder, though she made no move to pull away. "Jenkins can mind his own business," Quincy replied, reluctantly releasing her but keeping hold of her hand. "Though I suppose we should tell him you won't be needing that ride after all." They walked back to the stagecoach together, where Jenkins was making a show of checking his pocket watch while sneaking curious glances their way. "There's been a change of plans, Jenkins," Quincy announced. "Miss Taylor will be staying on at the ranch for the foreseeable future." The driver's eyebrows shot up, a knowing smile spreading across his weathered face. "Is that so?" "Well, now that's interesting news indeed." He tipped his hat to Tessa. Congratulations, Miss. Lawson here is one of the finest men in the territory, though he keeps to himself more than is healthy. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, Tessa replied with quiet dignity. I believe I've made the right decision. No doubt about it, Jenkins agreed cheerfully. And I'll be happy to spread the word in town that Quincy Lawson's finally showing some sense. He climbed back onto the driver's seat, gathering the reins. I expect we'll be seeing more of you both in Timber Creek now. Perhaps, Quincy replied noncommittally, though the thought of escorting Tessa to town, of being seen with her on his arm, filled him with unexpected pride. As the stagecoach pulled away, Quincy and Tessa stood side by side watching it grow smaller in the distance. The decision they'd just made hung in the air between them, momentous yet fragile, full of both promise and uncertainty. What happens now? Tessa asked softly, voicing the question that hovered unspoken between them. Quincy considered this, aware that they stood at the beginning of something neither had anticipated when they awoke that morning. Now we take the time to know each other properly, he said finally. I meant what I said, Tessa. I'm not asking for promises beyond your willingness to see if what I believe might be possible between us truly is. She nodded, relief evident in her expression. That seems wise. Then, with a touch of mischief lighting her eyes, she added, though I should warn you, I'm still as stubborn as my mother. Quincy laughed, the sound surprising him with its ease. I would expect nothing less. Together they walked back to the cabin, no longer his alone, but theirs to share, at least for now. As they crossed the threshold, Quincy was struck by how different the space already felt with the knowledge that Tessa would be staying. The cabin that had been merely shelter now held the potential to become a home. I should check on the herd, he said, after helping her bring her trunk back inside. The north pasture still needs attention after yesterday's fence repairs. Of course, Tessa replied, moving toward the kitchen with natural ease. I'll have supper ready when you return. The domestic exchange, so ordinary and yet so profound in its implications, filled Quincy with a sense of rightness that followed him throughout the day's work. As he rode the boundaries of his property, he found himself seeing it with fresh eyes, not as an isolated outpost, but as the foundation for something more meaningful than mere survival. Elizabeth's final wish echoed in his thoughts. My Christmas wish for you, my stubborn brother, is that you will find the courage to tear down the walls you've built. Let someone in before it's too late. Perhaps, Quincy reflected as he turned his horse toward home, toward Tessa. His sister had known exactly what she was doing when she sent this remarkable woman to his door on Christmas Day. The weeks that followed brought a gradual transformation to Quincy's ranch and to Quincy himself. January unfolded in a pattern of shared work and quiet evenings, each day bringing new discoveries about the woman who had so unexpectedly entered his life. He learned that Tessa rose with the sun without complaint, approaching each day's tasks with practical efficiency. She proved as capable with a needle as she was with farm chores, turning her skills to improving the cabin's sparse interior. Under her care, the dwelling slowly evolved from a utilitarian shelter to a genuine home, with small touches that reflected her presence. Cushions for the hard wooden chairs, curtains at the previously bare windows, a braided rug before the hearth. In turn, Tessa learned the rhythms of ranch life, adapting to its demands with remarkable resilience. Quincy taught her about cattle and horses, about predicting weather from cloud patterns and wind direction, about the thousand small skills that frontier survival demanded. She absorbed these lessons eagerly, her natural intelligence matching her willingness to work. Their evenings settled into a comfortable routine of shared meals and conversation by the fire. Tessa continued reading from Elizabeth's journal, the entries serving as both a connection to Quincy's sister and a catalyst for deeper discussions between them. Through these readings, Quincy came to understand Elizabeth's final months in a way letters alone could never have conveyed, while Tessa gained insight into the siblings' shared history and the events that had shaped Quincy's solitary nature. One evening in late January, as a particularly fierce blizzard howled outside the cabin, Tessa closed the journal with unusual abruptness. "What is it?" Quincy asked, noting her troubled expression. Tessa hesitated, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "There's an entry here I'm not sure I should read aloud. It's personal." About Elizabeth's illness, he guessed, having noticed how his sister's handwriting had grown increasingly unsteady in later entries. "No," Tessa replied softly. "About you, about us in a way though she couldn't have known." Curious now, Quincy moved to sit beside her on the small sofa he'd built years earlier. "Read it," he said gently. Whatever it is, I want to hear it. Tessa nodded, opening the journal again to the marked page. Her voice was soft as she read, April 10, 1875. The doctor says I have perhaps a month, though I suspect it may be less. Tessa continues to read to me when my strength fails, and today I shared with her my greatest regret, that I will never see Quincy find the happiness he deserves. I told her about the walls he has built since our parents died, how he retreated to that ranch not just to build something, but to hide from the pain of caring too deeply. She listened with such compassion that I finally revealed my secret wish, that she might take this journal to him after I'm gone, not just to deliver my final words, but because I believe with my dying breath that she is exactly the kind of woman who could breach those walls if given the chance. There is a strength in her that matches his, a practical hopefulness that balances his caution, a gentleness that might soften his hard edges. It is presumptuous, perhaps, to imagine orchestrating such a meeting from my deathbed. But as the veil between this world and the next grows thinner, I find myself believing more strongly in Providence, that sometimes souls are meant to find each other, even across great distances, even through loss. Tessa has promised to make the journey, though I've made it clear she is under no obligation beyond delivering my words. What happens after must be left to fate and free will. Still, I cannot help but hope. Tessa's voice faltered as she finished reading, her cheeks flushed with emotion. I didn't want you to think that this was somehow planned or manipulated. Quincy sat silent for a long moment, processing his sister's words. Far from feeling manipulated, he found himself filled with a profound gratitude for Elizabeth's final act of love, this gentle nudge toward a connection he would never have sought on his own. My sister always did think she knew what was best for everyone, he said finally, a smile softening his words. But in this case, I can't find it in my heart to disagree with her judgment. Relief washed over Tessa's face. Truly. Truly, Quincy confirmed, reaching for her hand. Elizabeth couldn't have known what would happen when you arrived, but she understood me well enough to know what I needed, even when I didn't recognize it myself. Tessa's fingers curled around his, warm and reassuring. She loved you very much. And I her, Quincy replied, the admission easier now than it would have been weeks ago. I wish I had been with her at the end. She knew that, Tessa assured him. But she also knew you had built something important here, something that couldn't be abandoned. She squeezed his hand gently. She was proud of you, Quincy, never doubt that. The blizzard raged on outside, but within the cabin, Quincy felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. Elizabeth's final gift hadn't been just the journal or even Tessa herself, but the permission to open himself to possibility again, to believe that love might be worth the risk of loss. As January gave way to February, the gradual thaw in Quincy's emotional landscape mirrored the subtle softening of winter's grip on the Montana prairie. He found himself laughing more often, sharing stories he'd long kept private, allowing Tessa glimpses of the man he'd been before grief had hardened him. Their relationship evolved with cautious optimism on both sides. Quincy was careful not to rush, aware that Tessa had put aside her own plans to stay at the ranch. For her part, Tessa maintained a respectful independence even as she integrated herself into the daily operations of the property. The first true test of their developing partnership came in mid-February when Quincy received word that a cattle buyer from Helena would be passing through Timber Creek, offering favorable prices for prime stock. The opportunity was too good to ignore, but it would require him to leave the ranch for 3 days to drive a small herd to town for inspection. I could postpone until spring, he said over breakfast, watching Tessa's reaction carefully. The timing isn't ideal with the weather still unpredictable. Tessa looked up from her coffee, her expression practical. Favorable prices won't wait for perfect weather, Quincy. You should go. The ranch would be entirely in your hands, he pointed out. It's a lot to ask after such a short time. I'm perfectly capable of keeping things running for 3 days, she replied with quiet confidence. The cows need feeding, the horses need care, and the fire needs tending. Everything else can wait until you return. Her matter-of-fact assessment both impressed and worried him. While Tessa had proven herself remarkably capable, the frontier could be unforgiving of even small mistakes. A sudden storm, a prowling predator, an accident while alone, the possibilities for disaster were endless. I know you're capable, he said carefully, but I don't like the thought of leaving you here alone. Perhaps you could stay in town while I'm gone. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house would surely have room. A flash of disappointment crossed Tessa's face before she masked it with a polite smile. If that's what you think best. Quincy recognized his mistake immediately. He was still thinking in terms of protection rather than partnership, undermining the very independence that made Tessa who she was. If they were to build something genuine together, it would have to be founded on mutual trust and respect. No, he said, correcting himself, that's not what I think best. I think you're right, you're more than capable of handling the ranch for a few days. I'm just not very good at letting go of control, it seems. The smile that bloomed on Tessa's face was worth any lingering anxiety he felt. I promise I won't burn the place down while you're gone, she teased gently, and I know how to use your rifle if necessary, though I pray it won't be. 2 days later, Quincy departed with 15 head of his best cattle, leaving Tessa standing on the porch waving him off. The separation, brief though it would be, felt strangely significant, the first real test of the tentative bonds they were forming. The journey to Timber Creek was uneventful, the cattle well-behaved despite the challenging terrain. Upon arrival, Quincy found the town buzzing with activity, the promised buyer already examining stock from other ranches in the area. His own cattle attracted favorable attention, and by evening he had negotiated a price that exceeded his expectations. That's fine-looking stock, Lawson, commented Samuel Thornton, a neighboring rancher who had also brought cattle to sell. You've done well with that land of yours. Thank you, Quincy replied, accepting the compliment with a nod as they stood outside the Timber Creek saloon. Heard you've had some changes out at your place, Thornton continued, a hint of curiosity in his weathered face. Jenkins mentioned a young lady staying on, relative of yours. Quincy hesitated, uncertain how to define Tessa's role in his life. She was neither servant nor family, neither officially courting nor merely a houseguest. A friend, he said finally. Miss Taylor was a friend of my sister's from back east. She's considering making Montana her home. Thornton nodded sagely. Good country for new beginnings. My Harriet came out as a mail-order bride 20 years ago, scared half to death of the wilderness. Now she'd fight a bear to defend our ranch. He chuckled at the memory. Takes a special kind of woman to thrive out here. It does indeed, Quincy agreed, thinking of Tessa's quiet competence and determined spirit. Well, you should bring her to the Founders' Day dance next month, Thornton suggested. Whole county will be there. Give her a proper welcome to the community. The invitation sparked an unexpected feeling of pride in Quincy, the prospect of introducing Tessa as, what? The question lingered as he completed his business in town and prepared for the return journey. By the time he headed back to the ranch, a new certainty had begun to crystallize in his mind about exactly what he wanted Tessa Taylor to be in his life. The return trip took longer than expected due to a late winter storm that slowed his progress. By the time Quincy crested the final rise overlooking his property, it was well past nightfall of the third day, and anxiety had begun to gnaw at him. Had Tessa managed all right alone? Had the storm hit the ranch as hard as it had the trail? His worries dissolved at the sight of lamplight glowing from the cabin windows and smoke rising steadily from the chimney. As he drew closer, he could see that the barn door was properly secured, fresh hay visible in the feeding troughs outside the corral. Everything was in perfect order. He had just dismounted when the cabin door flew open, spilling golden light across the snow. Tessa stood framed in the doorway, her expression shifting from concern to joy as she recognized him. You're back, she called, hurrying down the steps without pausing for a coat. I was beginning to worry when you didn't return this afternoon. The storm slowed us down, Quincy explained, surprised and touched by her evident relief at his return. Everything all right here. Perfect, she assured him, helping him unsaddle his horse. Though I'll admit the second night alone was a bit unnerving. The wind makes such strange sounds around the eaves. Together they settled his horse in the barn, working in companionable silence until the animal was properly brushed down and fed. Only then did Quincy notice that Tessa was shivering slightly in her thin dress. You should have grabbed a coat, he chided gently. It's freezing out here. I was too relieved to see you to think about it, she admitted, then blushed as if she'd revealed more than intended. The simple honesty of her response warmed something deep inside him. Without thinking, Quincy shrugged out of his heavy coat and draped it around her shoulders, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, she said softly, looking up at him with an expression that made his heart race. No, he replied, his voice rougher than usual. Thank you for being here, for keeping things running, for everything. They stood for a moment in the dim light of the barn, something unspoken passing between them. Then Tessa smiled, breaking the tension. You must be starving after your journey. I've kept stew warm on the stove, and there's fresh bread too. The cabin welcomed him with warmth and the aromas of home-cooked food that had been absent during his bachelor existence. Tessa moved about the kitchen with easy familiarity, serving him a hearty bowl of stew while asking questions about his trip to town. It was only after he'd eaten his fill and settled by the fire with a cup of coffee that Quincy truly relaxed, the tension of travel and responsibility easing from his shoulders. The cattle brought a good price, he told her, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small leather pouch. Enough to make some improvements to the ranch come spring. He hesitated, then added, and I bought something in town. For you. Tessa looked up in surprise as he handed her the pouch. For me, but why? To thank you, he said simply, for staying, for making this place feel like more than just somewhere to work and sleep. With curious fingers, Tessa opened the pouch and tipped its contents into her palm. There, glinting in the firelight, lay a delicate silver brooch shaped like a wild rose, modest but finely crafted, with a small pearl at its center. Oh, Quincy, she breathed, her eyes wide. It's beautiful. The shopkeeper said it came from San Francisco, he explained, suddenly feeling shy about the gesture. I thought it would suit you. Tessa traced the brooch's contours with gentle fingers. No one has given me anything so lovely since my father gave me my mother's locket before he left for the war. She looked up, her eyes shining. Thank you, I'll treasure it. The genuine pleasure in her response eased Quincy's uncertainty about the gift. He'd never purchased jewelry before, had agonized over whether the gesture was too forward or too intimate, but seeing her joy now, he knew he'd made the right choice. There's something else, he said, encouraged by her reaction. Samuel Thornton, a neighboring rancher, mentioned the county's Founders' Day dance next month in Timber Creek. He suggested I bring you, if you'd like to go. Tessa's eyes widened further. A proper dance. With music and everything. And everything, Quincy confirmed, smiling at her enthusiasm. It's quite an event, from what I understand. The whole county turns out for it. You've never gone before, she asked perceptively. Quincy shook his head. Never saw the point in socializing when there was work to be done. And now Tessa's question was soft but direct, her gaze steady on his face. Now, he said carefully, I find myself wanting to show you more of Montana than just this ranch. And perhaps, he hesitated, then committed to honesty, perhaps I'd like the county to know that Quincy Lawson no longer rides alone. The implications of his statement hung in the air between them, not quite a declaration, but certainly more than casual interest. Tessa's cheeks flushed prettily, but she didn't look away. I'd be honored to accompany you to the dance, she said simply. That night, lying in his bed listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch now accompanied by Tessa's soft breathing from across the hall, Quincy reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in less than 2 months. From solitary survival to tentative partnership, from emotional fortress to cautious opening, each step had felt both terrifying and right. Samuel Thornton's words echoed in his mind. Takes a special kind of woman to thrive out here. Tessa was certainly proving to be that woman, adapting to the demands of ranch life with grace and determination. But what truly distinguished her in Quincy's eyes was not just her practical capabilities, but her fundamental approach to life, the hope and resilience she brought to each day despite the losses she'd endured. Elizabeth had seen this quality in her friend and recognized it as the perfect counterbalance to her brother's hard-earned caution. The realization filled Quincy with renewed gratitude for his sister's final act of love, this unexpected gift that continued to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. The weeks leading up to the Founders' Day dance brought a flurry of activity to the ranch. The routine of daily chores continued, but now there were additional preparations as well. Tessa spent evenings altering her best dress for the occasion, while Quincy found himself polishing his seldom-used dress boots and pressing his good shirt with unaccustomed care. You're fussing more than I am, Tessa teased one evening, looking up from her sewing to find him examining his reflection in the small mirror over the wash basin. I hardly recognize this dandy who's replaced my practical rancher. My practical rancher. The casual possessive warmed Quincy in ways he couldn't articulate. "I just want to do you justice," he replied, only half joking. "It wouldn't do to escort the most beautiful woman in the county while looking like I just stepped out of the barn." Tessa blushed at the compliment, ducking her head to focus on her stitches. "You exaggerate, sir." "I don't," Quincy insisted, surprising himself with his boldness, "and every man at that dance will be thinking the same." The morning of the dance dawned clear and mild, an early spring warmth softening the lingering patches of snow. Chores were completed with efficient haste, leaving the afternoon free for preparations. Quincy gave Tessa privacy to dress and arrange her hair, retreating to the barn to ready the wagon and team that would transport them to town. When he returned to the cabin, freshly shaved and dressed in his best clothes, the sight that greeted him stole his breath. Tessa stood by the fire in a dress of deep sapphire blue, the color emphasizing the brilliant blue of her eyes and complementing her golden hair, which she had arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. The silver brooch he had given her adorned the modest neckline, catching the light with each breath she took. "You look," Quincy began, then found himself at a loss for words adequate to express his admiration. Tessa smiled shyly, smoothing the skirt of her dress with nervous hands. "Well, I do. I know it's not the height of fashion, but I've added some new trim and—" "You're beautiful," Quincy interrupted, finding his voice at last. "Absolutely beautiful." Her blush deepened, bringing a becoming color to her cheeks. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." The drive to Timber Creek was filled with a pleasant tension, a sense of anticipation that had little to do with the dance itself and everything to do with what the evening represented, their first public appearance together, a statement to the community about their developing relationship. Timber Creek had transformed for the occasion, the main street festooned with bunting and lanterns. The town hall, normally used for community meetings and church services, had been cleared for dancing, with benches lining the walls and a small stage erected for the musicians. As Quincy helped Tessa down from the wagon, he was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. His reputation as a solitary figure was well established in the county. His appearance at a social function with a beautiful woman on his arm was certain to raise eyebrows and spark speculation. "Quincy Lawson, as I live and breathe," called a friendly voice. Frank Holloway approached with his wife on his arm, genuine pleasure lighting his weathered face. "And this must be Miss Taylor. Jenkins has been singing your praises all over the county." Quincy made the introductions with a mixture of pride and protectiveness, noting how easily Tessa charmed the older couple with her genuine warmth and respectful attention. As more neighbors approached, curious to meet the woman who had apparently thawed the reserved rancher, Quincy found himself relaxing into the role of escort, drawing quiet satisfaction from the obvious impression Tessa was making. "She's a remarkable young woman," observed Mrs. Holloway during a moment when Tessa was engaged in conversation with some of the town's ladies. "You've been blessed, Quincy." "I have," he agreed simply, his eyes never leaving Tessa's animated face as she spoke with the other women. The dance itself was a lively affair, with a three-piece band providing music for everything from stately waltzes to energetic reels. Quincy, who had not danced since before his parents' deaths, found himself remembering the steps with surprising ease, especially with Tessa's hand in his and her encouraging smile guiding him through any momentary hesitations. During a break in the music, as they stood by the refreshment table sampling Mrs. Patterson's famous apple cider, Samuel Thornton approached with his wife Harriet. "Glad you could make it, Lawson," the rancher said heartily, extending his hand. "And even more pleased to meet your young lady. Harriet's been curious ever since I mentioned her." Introductions were made, and soon the two couples were engaged in comfortable conversation about ranch life and the coming spring season. Quincy noticed with approval how Tessa held her own in discussions of cattle breeding and crop rotation, her practical intelligence earning visible respect from the Thorntons. "You must join us for dinner soon," Harriet insisted as the conversation wound down. "It's a good 8 miles between our ranches, but neighbors should know one another, especially out here where we all depend on each other eventually." "We'd be delighted," Tessa replied before Quincy could formulate a response, her use of "we" feeling both natural and significant. As the evening progressed, Quincy found himself increasingly comfortable with the social interactions he had avoided for so long. With Tessa by his side, conversations flowed more easily, shared jokes seemed funnier, and the community he had kept at arm's length for years suddenly felt welcoming rather than intrusive. During a particularly beautiful waltz, as they moved together across the floor with growing confidence, Tessa looked up at him with an expression that made his heart skip. "Thank you for bringing me tonight," she said softly. "I'd forgotten how wonderful it feels to be part of a community." "I'm the one who should be grateful," Quincy replied, his hand warm at the small of her back as he guided her through a turn. "I wouldn't be here if not for you." "You might have come eventually," she suggested, a teasing light in her eyes. "No," he said with certainty. "I had convinced myself that isolation was safer." That connections only led to pain when they were inevitably broken. Tessa's expression softened, and now. Quincy drew a deep breath, knowing his answer mattered more than perhaps any words he had spoken to her thus far. "Now I believe that some connections are worth the risk, that a life shared, even with its inevitable sorrows, is fuller than a life protected but alone." The music swelled around them, but in that moment, they might have been the only two people in the room. Tessa's eyes, luminous in the lamplight, held his with an intensity that spoke volumes. "Elizabeth would be proud of you," she said finally, "for finding the courage she knew you had." As the dance wound down and couples began departing for home, Quincy and Tessa said their goodbyes with promises to return for the next community gathering. The drive back to the ranch was quieter than the journey in, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts about the evening and what it represented. The night was clear, the stars brilliant overhead and the air crisp with the promise of spring. As they approached the final rise before the ranch, Quincy pulled the wagon to a stop, setting the brake and turning to Tessa with sudden determination. "There's something I need to say," he began, his heart pounding with a nervousness he hadn't felt since those first days after her arrival. "Something I've been thinking about since before the dance, actually." Tessa looked at him expectantly, her face silvered by moonlight. "Yes. When we arrived tonight, everyone naturally assumed you were That we were," he faltered, frustrated by his own awkwardness. "What I mean to say is, our arrangement has been undefined. You staying at the ranch, us getting to know one another. But after tonight, people will have certain expectations." "Assumptions." "Does that concern you?" Tessa asked softly. "No," Quincy replied firmly. "What concerns me is that I haven't been clear enough about my own intentions, about what I hope might develop between us." He took her gloved hand in his, drawing courage from the contact. "Tessa, these past months have shown me what I was missing by closing myself off from connection. You've brought light and purpose back into my life in ways I couldn't have imagined when you first arrived on Christmas Day." Tessa's eyes shone in the darkness, her attention completely focused on his words. "I know it might seem soon," Quincy continued, "but life on the frontier has taught me that tomorrow isn't guaranteed, and I find myself unwilling to waste another day without making my feelings clear." He drew a steadying breath. "I'm asking for your permission to court you properly, with the intention of marriage if our feelings continue to align." The moment stretched between them, Tessa's expression unreadable in the moonlight. Then, slowly, a smile bloomed on her face, transforming her features with a joy that took Quincy's breath away. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that very much." Relief and happiness surged through him with such force that words seemed inadequate. Instead, Quincy acted on instinct, leaning forward to press his lips gently against hers in a first kiss that felt both momentous and inevitable, the natural culmination of the path they had been walking since her arrival. The kiss was brief but tender, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, Tessa's eyes remained closed for a heartbeat longer, her smile softening to something more intimate, more vulnerable. "I've been hoping you would ask," she admitted when she finally looked at him again. "I've grown to care for you more than I thought possible in such a short time." "As have I," Quincy replied, squeezing her hand gently before releasing it to take up the reins again. "Which is why I intend to do this properly, with the respect you deserve." The remainder of the drive passed in a comfortable silence charged with new awareness. As they approached the cabin, their home now in a more meaningful sense than before, Quincy found himself envisioning the future with a clarity and optimism that would have been foreign to him just months earlier. Spring arrived in earnest, transforming the landscape with astonishing speed. Patches of snow gave way to tender green grass, wildflowers bloomed in sheltered hollows, and the cattle grew sleek on fresh pasture. With the changing season came increased activity on the ranch, fences to mend, fields to plow, calves to brand, and 100 other tasks that kept both Quincy and Tessa busy from dawn to dusk. Their courtship unfolded against this backdrop of shared labor and purpose. Proper though it was in intention, their circumstances necessarily created an intimacy that more traditional courting might have delayed. They worked side by side during the day, shared meals and conversation in the evenings, and lived under the same roof with only the thin wall between their bedrooms maintaining appropriate separation. Quincy found himself cherishing the small moments that punctuated their days: Tessa's smile of triumph when she successfully delivered her first calf without assistance, the comfortable silence as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, the brush of her hand against his as they reached for the same tool. Each interaction deepened his certainty that what was growing between them was both genuine and enduring. As promised, they accepted the Thorntons' dinner invitation, making the journey to the neighboring ranch on a mild Sunday afternoon in late April. The visit proved enlightening for both of them. Harriet Thornton, a no-nonsense woman with 20 years of frontier experience, took Tessa under her wing immediately, sharing practical advice about everything from preserving vegetables to treating common livestock ailments. "You've chosen well," she told Tessa bluntly as they walked through her impressive garden. "Quincy Lawson may keep to himself, but there's not a more honest or hardworking man in the territory." Meanwhile, Samuel drew Quincy into a frank discussion about the challenges and rewards of married life on the frontier. "It's not easy," the older man admitted as they examined his new bull. "Takes compromise and patience on both sides, but having the right partner makes all the difference, someone who sees the work as a calling rather than a burden." By the time they departed, both Quincy and Tessa felt they had found not just neighbors but mentors and friends. The Thorntons' successful partnership, spanning 2 decades of frontier hardships, offered a model for what their own future might hold. "I like them," Tessa said as they drove home beneath a sky painted with sunset colors. "Especially Harriet, she doesn't sugarcoat anything." Quincy nodded, thinking of Samuel's forthright advice about the importance of clear communication and shared goals in a marriage. They've built something real together, something that's withstood time and hardship. "Is that what you want for us?" Tessa asked, her question direct but her tone gentle. "Yes," Quincy replied without hesitation. "A partnership strong enough to weather whatever comes, a home built on mutual respect and," he paused, then added softly, "and love." It was the first time either had used the word explicitly, though it had been growing between them with each passing day. Tessa's hand found his on the seat between them, her fingers warm and reassuring against his. "I want that too," she said simply. The acknowledgement, unadorned but profound, carried them the rest of the way home in a companionable silence that needed no further words. As spring advanced toward summer, bringing longer days and increased demands on their time, Quincy and Tessa settled into a rhythm that balanced work with moments of deliberate courtship. Sunday afternoons became sacred time, set aside for activities beyond the necessary chores. Sometimes they rode to a particularly beautiful spot on the property for a picnic. Other times they read aloud to each other from Elizabeth's small collection of books. Occasionally they simply sat on the porch, talking of their pasts and their hopes for the future. During one such Sunday in early June, as they sat beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree near the creek that gave the town its name, Quincy found himself studying Tessa's profile as she watched a family of deer drinking downstream. The past months had brought subtle changes to her appearance. Her fair skin had taken on a healthy glow from outdoor work, her hands had grown more calloused, and a sprinkling of freckles now adorned the bridge of her nose. To Quincy's eyes she had never been more beautiful. "What are you thinking?" she asked, catching his gaze with a smile. "That I'm the luckiest man in Montana territory," he replied honestly. "And that I don't want to wait any longer to make you my wife." Tessa's eyes widened at the directness of his statement. "Quincy, I know we agreed to a proper courtship," he continued, taking her hands in his. "And if you need more time, I understand. But these past months have shown me everything I need to know about the woman you are and the life we could build together." Emotion welled in Tessa's eyes, but she held his gaze steadily. "Are you certain?" Once said, these words can't be unsaid. "I've never been more certain of anything," Quincy assured her. "I love you, Tessa Taylor. Will you marry me?" The smile that bloomed on her face rivaled the summer sun for brightness. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, I will marry you, Quincy Lawson." Their kiss beneath the cottonwood tree was deeper than the chaste exchanges that had marked their courtship thus far, a seal on the promise they had just made, a glimpse of the deeper intimacy that awaited them as husband and wife. When they finally parted, both were breathless, Tessa's cheeks flushed and Quincy's heart pounding with a mixture of desire and reverence. "When," she asked softly, her fingers still entwined with his. "When shall we marry?" Practical considerations tempered Quincy's eagerness. Summer was the busiest season on the ranch, with hay to cut and store for winter, cattle to move to higher pastures, and 100 other tasks that couldn't be delayed. "After the hay is in," he suggested, "late August perhaps. That would give us time to prepare properly, and the weather should still be fair enough for travel if you'd like guests to attend." Tessa considered this, her expression turning thoughtful. "I have no family to invite, but I would like the Thorntons to be there, and perhaps the Holloways since they've been so kind." She smiled suddenly. "And Jenkins, of course. Without him, I might never have found you." "Then it's settled," Quincy said, lifting her hand to kiss her knuckles gently. "We'll be married in August with our friends to witness." The decision made, they lingered by the creek until the sun began to dip toward the horizon, discussing practical arrangements for their wedding and life afterward. Tessa would write to the dressmaker in Helena about fabric for a wedding dress. Quincy would speak with the circuit-riding minister who visited Timber Creek monthly to arrange the ceremony. Together, they would plan the small celebration to follow. As they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the future stretching before them with newfound clarity, Quincy found himself thinking of Elizabeth. Her final Christmas wish for him had been more prophetic than she could have known, not just that he would open his heart again, but that he would find in Tessa a partner who complemented and completed him in ways he hadn't known he needed. The weeks that followed their engagement were filled with a mixture of hard work and joyful anticipation. News of their upcoming marriage spread quickly through the small community, bringing congratulations from neighbors and a flurry of practical wedding gifts, preserves from Mrs. Holloway, a fine wool blanket from the Thorntons, even a set of silver spoons from Jenkins and his wife. Tessa threw herself into preparations for their life together with characteristic practicality and enthusiasm. She worked alongside Quincy during the day, then spent evenings sewing her wedding dress from fine cream-colored fabric ordered from Helena, or adding to the household linens she was creating for their married life. Under her care, the cabin continued its transformation from bachelor quarters to family home. For Quincy, the approaching wedding brought both joy and a renewed sense of purpose. With Tessa's encouragement, he began making improvements to the property that he had long postponed, expanding the cabin by adding a larger bedroom and a proper parlor, constructing a chicken coop so they could have fresh eggs, clearing land for a kitchen garden where Tessa could grow vegetables and herbs. Each improvement was made with their shared future in mind, each addition a tangible expression of his commitment to building a life together. As they worked side by side, discussing plans and making decisions jointly, Quincy found himself appreciating anew the partner he had found in Tessa, her intelligence, her resilience, her unwavering optimism balanced by practical good sense. By early August, with the hay safely stored in the barn and the wedding just weeks away, a letter arrived that disrupted their careful plans. The circuit minister who was to perform their ceremony had fallen ill and would not be making his usual rounds for at least 2 months. "What should we do?" Tessa asked as they sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread before them. "Wait until he recovers." Quincy considered the options, reluctant to postpone a day they had both been anticipating with increasing eagerness. "We could travel to Helena," he suggested. "There's a proper church there and we could be married immediately." But practical obstacles arose to this plan as well. The journey would take several days each way, leaving the ranch unattended during a critical period. Additionally, it would mean abandoning the small celebration they had planned with the friends who had supported their relationship from the beginning. "Perhaps Judge Wilson in Timber Creek could marry us," Tessa proposed. "I believe he has the authority." This solution satisfied both their desire to proceed with the wedding as planned and their wish to include their small community in the celebration. The following day, Quincy rode to town to speak with the judge, who readily agreed to perform the ceremony on the original date. "Been marrying folks in this county for 15 years, the judge assured him. "Not as fancy as a church wedding, perhaps, but just as binding in the eyes of the law." With this final obstacle overcome, the days seemed to accelerate toward their wedding. August 18th dawned clear and perfect, the sky a brilliant blue overhead and a gentle breeze tempering the summer heat. Quincy, who had spent the previous night at the Thorntons' ranch in accordance with tradition, returned home mid-morning to prepare for the ceremony. The transformation of the ranch took his breath away as he approached. Garlands of wildflowers adorned the porch rails and fence posts. Tables borrowed from neighbors had been set up beneath the cottonwood trees, covered with white cloths and set with the community's collective china and silver. A small arch fashioned from bent saplings and decorated with more wildflowers stood in the yard where the ceremony would take place. Inside the cabin, Harriet Thornton had taken charge, directing the preparation of food and ensuring everything was ready for the celebration to follow. She shooed Quincy away to dress in the barn, insisting that he not see Tessa until the ceremony. "It's tradition, young man," she declared firmly, "and some traditions are worth keeping, even out here." By early afternoon, guests began arriving, the Holloways and Thorntons, Jenkins and his wife, Judge Wilson, and several other neighbors who had become friends over the past months. Quincy greeted them from the porch, dressed in a new suit ordered specially from Helena, his usual confidence tempered by a nervous anticipation he couldn't quite suppress. At precisely 3 o'clock, Harriet Thornton emerged from the cabin and nodded to Samuel, who had been designated to escort Tessa in the absence of any family. A hush fell over the assembled guests as the cabin door opened once more. Tessa appeared on Samuel's arm, radiant in her cream-colored dress with Elizabeth's silver brooch pinned at her throat. Her golden hair was arranged in an elegant twist adorned with small white flowers, and she carried a simple bouquet of wildflowers tied with a blue ribbon. But it was her expression that captured Quincy's heart anew, a mixture of joy, love, and quiet confidence that seemed to illuminate her from within. As she walked toward him across the yard they had tended together, Quincy felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. This remarkable woman, who had arrived at his door 6 months ago with nothing but Elizabeth's journal and her own indomitable hope, had transformed not just his ranch, but his very understanding of what it meant to live rather than merely survive. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, Judge Wilson leading them through vows that echoed across the Montana landscape as they promised to love, honor, and cherish one another for all their days. When Quincy slipped the simple gold band onto Tessa's finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother, carefully preserved all these years, her eyes shimmered with tears that matched his own. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge declared, his voice carrying across the yard. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Lawson." Quincy needed no further invitation. Drawing Tessa close, he kissed her with a tenderness that conveyed all he felt for this woman who had journeyed so far to find him, who had breached the walls around his heart with nothing but hope and love. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under the stars. Neighbors who had once viewed Quincy as the solitary rancher now embraced him and his bride as an integral part of their community. Stories were shared, advice was offered, some more welcome than others, and toasts were raised to the future of the Lawson ranch and family. As night fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, Samuel Thornton called for attention, raising his glass in a final toast. "To Quincy and Tessa Lawson," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet gathering. "May your partnership bring you strength in hard times and joy in good ones. May your ranch prosper, your family grow, and your love deepen with each passing year." "To the Lawsons," echoed the guests, raising their glasses in unison. Later, after the last guests had departed with calls of congratulation and final embraces, Quincy and Tessa stood alone on the porch of their cabin, their home, gazing out at the moonlit landscape that was now truly theirs together. "Happy?" Quincy asked softly, his arm around her waist. Tessa leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. "Completely," she replied, "though I can hardly believe how much has changed since Christmas Day." "When you arrived with nothing but hope and Elizabeth's journal," Quincy remembered, kissing the top of her head gently. "Not nothing," Tessa corrected, turning in his arms to face him. "I had Elizabeth's love for you, which guided me here. I had hope for a new beginning, and I had faith that there was purpose in the journey, even when I couldn't see where it was leading." Quincy smiled, recognizing the quiet wisdom that had first drawn him to her. "And now, what do you have now, Mrs. Lawson?" "Everything," she replied simply, reaching up to touch his face with tender fingers. "A home, a purpose, a husband I love more than I thought possible." Her smile widened. "And a future we'll build together, one day at a time." As they crossed the threshold into their home as husband and wife, Quincy knew with absolute certainty that Elizabeth's final Christmas wish had been fulfilled beyond anything his sister could have imagined. The walls he had built around his heart had not merely been breached, but transformed into the foundation for something far stronger, a love capable of withstanding whatever the frontier might bring, a partnership equal to both the beauty and harshness of the life they had chosen. Tessa had indeed arrived with nothing but hope and love, and in giving those gifts freely, she had helped him discover that they were, in the end, the only things that truly mattered.